Mountain maggot, the continued. The origins of the mountain maggot are lost in time and cannot be determined with any scientific exactitude. According to one ancient Zamonian legend, the first mountain maggots crawled out of the dung excreted by giant cyclopses. According to another, they evolved from tears of storm gods, Gloomberg tempests the. What is certain, given the present porous condition of the Gloomberg Mountains, is that the earliest mountain maggots must have begun to gnaw their way through them hundreds and thousands of years ago, although no scientific proof of this has yet been adduced. It is surmised that, in addition to its vernacular relationship, the mountain maggot has an affinity to the termite. This is suggested by the perforations in the Gloombergs, which are reminiscent of a termite's nest. Mountain maggots are solitary creatures. When two of them meet, as they occasionally do, they tend to ignore each other. One of biology's great unsolved riddles is how mountain maggots reproduce in view of their lack of contact with others of their kind. The answer may lie in another Zamonian legend that tells of the Great Queen, a maggot that lives in the interior of the Gloomberg and lays steel eggs from which the infant grubs emerge. There is, however, no scientific confirmation of this. The mountain maggot didn't notice me at all, or if it did, no more so than I would have noticed a fly on the wall. It simply went on with its work, marched over to the next tunnel wall, opened its stainless steel jaws, and blew out a jet of flame the thickness of my forepaw. Then it tore off some big chunks of half-molten metal with its pincers, tossed them in its mouth, and noisily swallowed them. Having swiftly made a new hole, the creature climbed through it. I am one of the few to have witnessed the fascinating process whereby a mountain maggot makes its way through the Gloomberg Mountains. The wall of metal melts, and there a hole comes into sight. I feel a gentle breath of air, and through the gap streams light. What was that? Mountain Maggot, the poem. This 78-stanza poem by Wilfrid the Wordsmith is regarded as the acme of Zamonian organic verse. Organic verse, wasn't that the highest form of Zamonian poetry? One at which so many mediocre poets had failed? Yes, but what did it have to do with the mountain maggot? Organic verse. In this, a supreme manifestation of Zamonian lyricism, the poet adopts the perspective of an organism which is so rarely found as to escape notice in the normal course of events, e.g. reptilian rescuer, the, or mountain maggot, the. Widely regarded as the finest example of organic poetry is the poem Mountain Maggot Thee by Wilfrid the Wordsmith. I remember now, I knew all of Wilfrid the Wordsmith's sonnets by heart, but I'd shirked learning the mountain maggot because of its immense length. Mountain Maggot Thee poem continued. Wilfrid puts himself in the place of a mountain maggot and gives a highly detailed account of its laborious journey through ferruginous rock. In the final verse, he makes the maggot find its way out into the open air, and thereby lends meaning to its seemingly pointless endeavors. This suggests that the poet intended his rhyming quatrains to be a hymn to a hard-working life and its underlying purpose. Of course, if anyone could find a way out of the Gloomberg labyrinth, it was a mountain maggot. I only had to follow at its stainless steel heels until it mounted a wall that led to the open air. Gingerly I climbed through the hole which had cooled, and into the next tunnel, but now already one passage further on. The maggot was burning a hole in the tunnel wall with its blowtorch breath. At last I had a definite chance of escaping from the labyrinth. You can't beat a good education. The mountain maggot. Following the maggot was fairly simple. It took no notice of me even when I came within eyeshot, and once, when I lost sight of it for a short time, I could tell which way it had gone by the freshly melted holes and metallic crunching sounds. I amused myself en route by mentally dipping into Nightingale's encyclopedia, which for some reason kept quoting the mountain maggot over and over again. I know it by heart to this day. Give way it must, that iron wall, and let me through it I climb. I cannot stop to eat it all. I never have the time. I bore holes with my fiery breath, digest the iron with ease, and chew it with my still stainless teeth, as if it were but cheese. Away, you troglotrolls, you'd best steer clear of me. Begone. Although I never pause to rest, my work is never done. To give the poet his due, Wilfrid Wordsmith certainly had what it takes to turn oneself into a mountain maggot. I particularly liked the verse about the troglotrolls. My only problem was the maggot's stamina, which seemed to be inexhaustible. It never stopped to rest and didn't appear to sleep either, not at least while I was following it. Mountain Maggot Thee. Continued. The mountain maggot belongs to the unisomnolent genus, i.e. it sleeps only once in its life. This it does shortly after attaining its 200th birthday. but for 14 years at a stretch. During this time it subsists on its accumulated mineral reserves and breeds only once a month. I myself was running out of stamina after following hard on the creature's heels for 3 days. The speed and diligence with which it worked were colossal. More and more often I had to sit down and take a breather. I even dozed from time to time. On one occasion I awoke to find the mountain maggot gone. The nearest hole had cooled off long ago, and I couldn't hear it work. Ahead of me lay a fork in the tunnel. If I took the wrong turning, all my efforts would have been in vain. First right and second left, hooray, it's easy to remember. If only I can find the way, I'll get out by December. The last hole in the wall that had led to the right, so I now followed the poem's instructions and turned left. There was no guarantee that Wilfred's suggestion was correct, of course. It might simply have been poetic license, but it was my only hope. Sure enough, in the next passage I found a relatively fresh maggot hole. I climbed over hissing pools of molten iron, stopped to listen in the passage after that, and was relieved to hear the familiar sounds of the mountain maggot at work. I hurried in their direction. Strangely enough, I got the impression that the darkness was becoming less intense. I turned a corner and ran full tilt into a wall of light. The wall of metal melts, and there a hole comes into sight. I feel a gentle breath of air, and through the gap streams light, the hole in the mountain. My eyes gradually accustomed themselves to the glare. Fanned by the cool breeze, I saw the mountain maggot standing with its back to me in the circular hole that led to the outside world. I drew nearer, quite unafraid, and walked right up to it. Even now it took no notice of me. Perhaps, like me, it was simply too overcome by the panorama that it presented itself to our gaze. Beneath us, the crest of the Gloomberg stretched away into the far distance, and the clouds beyond them formed a flat expanse as white as cotton wool. It seemed we were on the highest pinnacles of the rock in the entire mountain range, and the view below was obscured by mist. The sunlight warmed my stiff limbs, my hopes revived. Then a fat black storm cloud thrust itself in front of the sun, and the temperature dropped in an instant. I leaned out and peered over the edge. The peak was several miles high, and the surface of the Gloombergs as smooth as polished marble. Not even the most experienced climber could have found a foothold. All my hopes vanished in a flash. The mountain maggot made some sniffling, lip-smacking noises, nervously shuffled from foot to foot, and emitted exclamations that sounded like "ee" and "ooh," and then it turned abruptly and went back into the tunnel. I hesitated for only a moment, then followed. What use was an exit at this altitude? I had no choice but to remain with the creature and hope that it would sometime make an opening lower down. Swiftly but aimlessly, or so it seemed, the mountain maggot burrowed ever deeper into the mountain, and I went with it. Bong! What was that? A bell note in the bowels of a mountain? The maggot stopped short. Bong! There it was again, a little fainter and further away. Bong! A third bell note, louder and nearer than the first two. "Ee-oo," said the mountain maggot. Bong 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 bong. I had yet to learn what a thunderstorm in the Gloombergs entailed. It seldom ever rained in those mountains, but when it did so with a vengeance. From the Encyclopedia of Marbles, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and Its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Gloomberg Tempest, Because of their iron content, the atmosphere above the Gloomberg Mountains always carries a heavy electrical charge. Thunderstorms are a very rare natural phenomenon here. When they do occur, however, the consequence is something that need not fear comparison with any other natural disaster, and is known as the Gloomberg Tempest, or the Tantrum of the Gods. Within minutes, gigantic black rain clouds accumulate above the mountains miles high and dispense raindrops as big and heavy as kitchen stoves. A single one of these raindrops can fill a bathtub or slay an elk. Millions of flashes of lightning per second turn night into day, darting in directions from which normal electrical discharges are debarred. Long, thin thunderbolts go hissing into valleys and send up cascades of white sparks, others white as streets, cleave whole mountain peaks in half. Bolts of globe lightning fall to earth like spinning comets. Huge explosions at their point of impact create smoking craters filled with molten iron. The flashes of lightning take a wide variety of forms. Some undulate through the mountains like giant serpents. Others are short and sharp like spears. They even quiver for a moment after piercing the ground. As for the accompanying thunder, it sounds as if demented giants are beating the iron mountains like a gong. What we were hearing were the first immense raindrops striking the hollow mountains and making them ring. Then the thunder started, amplified 1,000-fold by the reverberating tunnel walls. I had never been exposed to such a din in all my life. For the first time I was glad to be inside the Gloombergs. The elements were welcome to rage outside. I couldn't have wished for a better protection than the mountain's miles-thick layers of iron. The mountain maggot was looking worried, however. It turned on the spot, emitting whimpering sounds, and seemed to be looking for something. Ee-oo, ee-oo, ee-ee. That such an immensely strong, almost invulnerable creature should be anxious made me anxious too. Why should it be scared of a thunderstorm when we were in the middle of a mountain? Gloomberg tempests, the continued. The Gloomberg mountains are porous in structure, being perforated like a termite's nest, the mountain maggot the by countless passages. Because many of these lead to the open air, the mountainsides afford the masses of water teeming down during a Gloomberg tempest numerous apertures through which to penetrate the tunnels and wash them out. This is hygienically beneficial to the mountains, but life-threatening to the creatures that inhabit them. Natural denizens of the Gloombergs, like mountain maggots and troglodytes, do, however, possess innate skills that enable them to survive under such conditions. A mountain maggot, for example, can hold its breath for as long as 2 hours. I faced death by drowning. I was anything but natural denizen of the Gloombergs, nor did I possess any innate skills that would have enabled me to survive underwater. The fat, heavy raindrops began by collecting into rivulets, developed into streams as they ran downhill along the tunnels, and finally became raging torrents. At some points they filled the whole passages like water rushing down a drain pipe. Not that I realized yet I was in mortal danger. The mountain maggot had found a projection in the tunnel wall and had driven its steel claws into the rock. It clenched its powerful jaws and hugged the wall. This was a mountain maggot's customary method for coping with a Gloomberg tempest. It clung to the rock and held its breath until the flood subsided. The thundering masses of water propelled the air in tunnels ahead of them, creating a shockwave that heralded the cataclysm to follow. It wasn't until I felt the wind in my fur that I sensed something very unpleasant was coming my way. Then, with the roar of a subway train entering a station, the flood came racing around the bend. Preceded by a circular plug of foam, it sped towards me, washed over the mountain maggot, and thundered in my direction. I took to my heels, but the water closed over my head almost immediately. Underwater. I'm good at holding my breath, but I can't manage 2 hours. With the requisite preparation, a little meditation, and some deep breathing exercises, I can hold my breath for up to 20 minutes. At sea, you're sometimes submerged by sizable waves, or sucked under by a sinking ship, or swallowed by a whale, or carried down into the depths by a kraken. In short, good lung capacity is part of every sea bear's basic equipment. On this occasion, however, I had no opportunity to meditate. Indeed, I didn't even get a chance to draw a decent breath. From one moment to the next, I was completely engulfed in liquid, a doubly shocking experience when you've long been living in extremely dry conditions. The flood propelled me through the maze of tunnels like a rifle bullet. A roaring sound filled my ears, and all I could see was an explosion of white sparks occasioned by the pressure of the water on my eyeballs. Then, because I wisely and instinctively shut my eyes, I couldn't see anything at all. I sped through the darkness, blind and weightless, spinning round and round as I went. The air in my lungs slowly began to make its presence felt. When you breathe under normal circumstances, the air is a welcome guest and keeps coming and going. Breathe in, and it enters the bronchial elevator, rides it down to the lungs, takes a quick look around, breathe out, and it exists at the same route. In this instance, the air remained imprisoned. After a while, it seemed to expand, pressing against the walls of my lungs like small captive beasts desperately seeking a way out. To take my mind off this unpleasant sensation, I decided to open my eyes briefly. The water was surprisingly clear, being irradiated by the phosphorescence on the tunnel walls, and I couldn't even see minute air bubbles dancing around my body in a frenzied ballet. Air bubbles! If each bubble contained some oxygen, several might contain a whole breath, and there were thousands of them. They might even be the remains of the puff of wind I'd encountered in the maze of the tunnels. I had only to reach them and suck in the life-giving oxygen. So I puckered my lips into a short straw and performed a few contortions, maneuvering my head into the vicinity of a string of whirling air bubbles. I had just reached the nearest of these life-saving globules of oxygen when the whole bunch put on speed. I followed them, swimming strongly, and closed with them once more. Only 3 strokes separated me from the nearest bubble. 1, 2, and an eddy overtook me, captured the serpentine string of bubbles, and bore them off down a dark side tunnel. I yelled with disappointment, thereby expelling the last of the oxygen from my lungs. A submarine constricted by water pressure must experience the same sensation. Then I saw the troglodyte, or rather I thought I saw the troglodyte because it was likelier to have been a hallucination conjured up in my brain by lack of oxygen. The creature drifted past me, lying on its back with its hands clasped behind its head. It overtook me provokingly slowly. It gave me an amiable smile and waved before it vanished around the bend in the tunnel. No doubt about it, this was the end. My internal organs seemed to be inflated to bursting point. My eyes were bulging from their sockets, my ears roared as if I were standing at the foot of the Niagara Falls. I felt as if boiling water were flowing through my veins and collecting in my lungs. A violent fit of coughing assailed me. I was ready to give up. I would simply open my mouth and let the water in. Anything was preferable to this torment. I opened my mouth and breathed in, prepared to die by drowning, but it wasn't lethal water that filled my agonized lungs. It was clear, life-giving mountain air. The rainwater had found its own way out and sluiced me out as well. Through the last hole the mountain maggot had made, I was free at last. But at what price? Our exit. But at what a price? My exit was situated at an altitude of roughly 5 miles. I went plunging down like a fish trapped in a waterfall, a thin but very long waterfall. The view of Zamonia must have been magnificent, but I had no time to enjoy it. Such was the abrupt end to my life in the Gloombergs. So the transition from my 6th life to my 7th was a watery one. I continued my downward progress until there were only 2 miles to impact. This was a predicament that called for exceptionally careful coordination between my mental faculties and physical abilities. "Canned sardines," said a voice in my head. What? Canned sardines. It sounded like Professor Nightingale, but what was all this nonsense about canned sardines? "Knowledge is night," said Nightingale's voice. Only a mile and a half to go. I could see that the waterfall ended in a lake. However, when you fall from such a height, it makes no difference whether the surface you hit is concrete or water. It was a perfect opportunity for a reptilian rescuer, but there wasn't one in sight. Perhaps I was in the grid square that had been left unsupervised by Mac's retirement. Tyrannosaurus Rex. The encyclopedia in my brain seemed to be quoting headwords purely at random. "Knowledge is night." Only a mile left. The professor had always used this aphorism as a way of steering our thoughts in every possible direction, but what else had he said? Canned sardines. True, canned sardines. Canned sardines were very filling. They came in cans. The cans had to be opened. Nightingale had applied this intellect to that problem. Bacteria. Nightingale had infected me with his intellectual bacteria. Was he hinting that I myself was capable of similar mental feats? Another 2,000 feet. At a rough guess. Tyrannosaurus Rex. The professor had turned into a dinosaur, ergo it was possible to transform oneself by the power of thought. Was I meant to turn into a dinosaur? Where was the sense in that? I would only become heavier and hit the water even harder. 1,800 feet. Canned sardines. He meant me to turn into a sardine. A fish trapped in a waterfall. That made more sense. As a sardine, I would be bound to survive the fall. But how had Nightingale done it? He had 7 brains. I had only 1. Knowledge is night. Darkness, of course. Darkness enhances one's intelligence. I shut my eyes. 1,500 feet. I thought of sardines. A shoal of them appeared in my mind's eye, gliding through the waterfall with me as we plummeted into the depths. 1,200 feet. The sardine trick. I metamorphosed, but not into a sardine. I became a primordial cell, just as Nightingale had done in the course of our lesson. I grew bigger, developed into a multicellular organism, a tiny glassy fish. Scales sprouted from my translucent skin, gills and powerful fins appeared. I felt myself filling up with bones. I inhaled the water like fresh air. I had turned into a sardine at last. The water gave a sort of jolt, and a hurricane of air bubbles seeped around me. I had dived into the lake almost without noticing it. Eager to reach the surface, I struck out with my fins, but they weren't fins any longer. They were my legs and paws. I surfaced and took a deep breath. I had ceased to be a sardine. That was quite obvious, because my clothes and fur were sodden by the time I had laboriously swum ashore. I wrung out my clothes and shook the water out of my fur. Naked and rather stiff but alive and contented, I sat down at the water's edge and surveyed my surroundings. The lake was fringed with huge fir trees, and I greedily inhaled the fresh, rosin-scented forest air. Fat rain clouds were still chasing each other across the sky. But the storm was over indeed. The setting sun was blazing down through the scattered rents in the clouds. I had every reason to feel pleased. Not only had I escaped from the maze of tunnels, I had cheated death twice over, death by drowning and by multiple injuries. What had happened? Had I really turned into a fish, or had Nightingale used the encyclopedia to hypnotize me into behaving like one? Whichever, he had helped me to embark on a new life. 7. My Life in the Great Forest. From the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and Its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale, Great Forest The Great Forest owes its somewhat unimaginative name to the fact that no one wants anything to do with it, even in theory. It is simply avoided on principle. Everyone gives it a wide berth and advises everyone else not to set foot in it. The few people who have ever entered the forest in defiance of the advice have never been seen in again. Many assert that the forest is inhabited by plant sprites and leaf witches. Others surmise that it is a single evil being whose roots reach down to hell and are watered by the great goat himself. Where these legends come from and on what factual circumstance they are based is unknown. The inhabitants of Zamonia have simply and tacitly agreed never to enter the great forest. Darkness was falling when I wandered into the forest. Old wives' tales don't impress me. I'm not scared of forests, and haven't been so ever since I lived on Hobgoblin's Island. An experience like that inures you to such things. On the contrary, I relish the silence, and more particularly the fresh air. After all time I'd spent in an airless maze of tunnels, fresh air seemed an incredible luxury. The storm had receded as quickly as it had come. The treetops were bending in the gentle breeze, which was all that remained of it, and beneath them reigned a cool cathedral hush. Looking up through the canopy of foliage, I could sometimes glimpse the dark depths of the cosmos strewn with twinkling stars. So much space above me. The trees became denser the further I went, but I walked on briskly. If a plant sprite or leaf witch really did live here, I wouldn't have objected to a little company. All that aroused my misgivings was the absolute silence. Even in Hobgoblin Forest there had been noises, owls hooting, birds twittering, squirrels scampering, woodpeckers morse, the omnipresent rustle of insects foraging on the forest floor. Here I heard nothing of the kind, just my muffled tread on the soft carpet of leaves and the occasional snap of a rotten branch under my hind paws. So bad was the great forest's reputation that even worms and ants avoided it. At length, tired out with the walking in fresh air, I simply curled up on the forest floor, covered myself with leaves, and went to sleep. It was the most refreshing night's rest I'd had for ages, totally dreamless, and as peaceful as the great forest itself. I make plans. It was late the next morning, almost noon when I awoke. I gathered a few berries, nuts, and chestnuts, munched a handful of dandelion leaves, and washed the whole meal down with some cool water from a spring. Then I set off, meaning to leave the forest behind me as soon as possible and get to the nearest outpost of civilization. I pictured a little village on the edge of the forest, a place in which to practice a profession with the knowledge I'd acquired at the Nocturnal Academy, at least for a limited period. I could work as a teacher, give lessons in astronomy and fossilology, nightingaleology, Zamodian archaeology, and ferromagnetic deep-sea botany. Name an occupation and I would pursue it. Lace maker wanted? At your service. I would have worked for equal facility as a sponge driver, or a violin maker, wine grower, piano tuner, or dentist. I could have translated books from all languages into Zamodian or vice versa. Perhaps there was an opening for a grinder of telescope lenses, or an expert on geodectic oscillations between the poles. I might even be able to open a small private school of my own and pass on Nightingale's store of wisdom to my pupils. Thanks to the excellent education I've received at the Nocturnal Academy, my professional opportunities were positively limitless. The great forest, quite contrary to its evil reputation, the forest was a wonderful place. The best thing about it was the absolute normality. It wasn't a creeper-infested, almost impassable jungle like the forest on Hobgoblin Island, or a treacherous tropical paradise with singing flowers and glass vegetation like Gormetica or Insularis. It was just a healthy forest of the kind that grows in temperate climatic zones, with tall firs and sturdy oaks, slender poplars, and an exceptional number of silver birches, the latter arrayed at such regular intervals that they might have been individually planted by hand. Berry-laden bushes grew here and there, and every few steps one came across sun-dappled clearings sprinkled with daisies and toadstools and crystal-clear streams and pools. It was a genuine delight to roam the forest. I came across no obstacles at all, not even a fallen tree. My chronic headache, the eternally dry cough occasioned by particles of iron, the backache I got from bending double, all these were things of the past. I walked all day long, almost with no break. It was such a joy to be out of the rabbit warren. Then darkness descended on the forest once more. I would soon have to find a place to sleep. The possibilities were legion, and it was hard to settle on one of the many picturesque sleeping quarters that presented themselves. I had just come to a clearing, and my nose picked up a feeling that I had never experienced before. Although the reader will rightly object that you don't detect emotions with your nose, that was just what had happened here. I smelt the feeling of being at home. It was a strange but far from alarming sensation, and then I was transfixed by the most beautiful melody I'd ever heard. Someone was humming in such a sweet, true voice that tears sprang to my eyes. I tiptoed to the edge of the clearing, hid behind a big oak tree, and looked for the source of the song. There, seated amid a sea of daisies and illumined by the last slanting rays of the setting sun, like a saint in an old painting, was a girl. But not just any girl, she was a girl bear, and her fur was as blue as my own. From the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Great Forest, the continued. According to one legend, the Great Forest used many years ago in its inhabited days to be the haunt of a special kind of bear with colored fur, Ursus polychromus. These animals are said to have been good-natured, sedentary creatures with a talent for beekeeping. The legend further states that they vanished from the forest one day, but nobody knows why or where they went to. No wonder I felt at home here. Perhaps this is the forest of my primeval ancestors. There had to be something in the legend. Instinct told me so, and the existence of the girl bear proved this beyond doubt. Although I thought in my initial transport of emotion that the girl bear's fur was the same color as mine, that wasn't entirely true. Mine is more of a dark navy with a touch of ultramarine like the deep turbulent sea, whereas hers was a much paler blue like that of the sky, the cornflower, or the forget-me-not. I had never seen a more fascinating creature. From now on and for all eternity, this girl Bluebear would be the focal point of my existence. The sole purpose of my life was to love her. I yearned to defend her from any danger that dared to contest our happiness, fight it off with tooth and claw. I would have ripped the heart out of that danger, if it had one, and devoured it raw. I felt capable of boiling away the ocean to a bowl of fish soup, just with the flames of my passion. I could have stopped the world rotating, then reversed and started it, just for one more glimpse of the gesture, which she stuck a daisy behind her ear. Only one thing that I felt quite certain was beyond me. I could never accost the girl. The reader will now assume, with some justification, that my very next move was to introduce myself to this wonderful creature with her heart. She was, after all, in addition to all her merits, the only other blue bear that had ever come my way. I felt an almost agonizing urge to speak to her. The conditions for a first encounter could hardly have been more favorable. The sunset, my restored appearance, the romantic glade. Fate had destined us for one another. Of that I was convinced, but at that moment I was overcome by the emotion I never before experienced in that particular form, timidity. I instinctively sought an even better hiding place behind a big clump of stinging nettles. Agonized shyness, the very thought of emerging with the undergrowth and introducing myself to the girl brought me out in a cold sweat. What if I tripped and fell on my face? What if she laughed at me to scorn? Or took fright? First impressions, they say, are always the most important. Would she think me ugly? What state was my fur in? Did my breath smell? Were my flies unbuttoned? Had I washed my ears? Those were other equally absurd ideas flashed through my mind, although in my existing state I found them perfectly reasonable to begin with. Therefore I continued to crouch in the undergrowth as though paralyzed, and confined myself to marveling at the girl Bluebear from afar. And that was really all I did for the next few days, remain in hiding and feast my eyes on the beautiful stranger, the forest and its dense undergrowth, the corpulent oaks with their tracery of branches, the tall grass, the stinging nettles, ferns and blackberry bushes, all offered plenty of cover. The cottage in the clearing. The girl Bluebear lived in a little cottage on the edge of the clearing where I'd first seen her. The house was built entirely of timber and faced with split logs. It was a rendezvous for all the animals I'd missed elsewhere in the forest. All sought shelter there, and all had made their homes either in the clearing itself or nearby. Birds had built their nests in the leafy canopy. Squirrels and wolves scurried in and out of doors and windows as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Brimstone butterflies fluttered across the glade. Portly bumblebees hummed with contentment as they went in search of honey, and a family of 9 ducks swam in the little stream that flowed through the center of the clearing. In front of the cottage was a small garden expertly divided into functional and ornamental sections. In the former, plump cauliflowers and pumpkins proliferated, fat tomatoes gleamed, and a big rhubarb leaves shielded a double row of radishes from the sun. Rosemary, parsley, and chives grew alongside bright red poppies and wild roses. A funny little potato patch, a row or two of carrots and onions, a miniature forest of watercress, clumps of marjoram, mint, and sage. It was clear that the gardener not only displayed an unerring and aesthetic sense, but had a firm grasp of dietary essential foodstuffs and the Zamonian and international herbs that went with them. Also growing there were thyme and dill, angelica and arrowroot, rocket and chervil, eggwort and coriander, rabbit's delight and elfweed, borage and mustard and cress, monk's hood and chamomile, basil and curly leaf petrosilium, saxifrage and slipperwort. Saxifrage and slipperwort. In the ornamental section, the loveliest of Zamonian flowers grew peaceably alongside other exotic varieties, witch's pride and golden primrose, calendula and campanula, asphodel and mandragora, columbine and angel's eye, hydrangea and ruggerball, ranunculum and Aldentian rose, begonia and parsley orchid, seahorse grass and sassafras blossom, Bloomberg moss and coconut scented cowslip, black eyed Susan and paradise lily, all were admirably arranged as the colors on a master's painter's canvas. What a wonderful place to live in. The girl Bluebear spent her days feeding the animals and tending her garden. Sometimes, too, she took a basket and disappeared into the forest, to return at dusk laden with freshly gathered fruit, berries, and mushrooms. When supper was in preparation, tempting aromas issued from the cottage and drifted across the clearing. I observed all the girl in her activities, not only hoeing the garden and feeding the animals, but seated on the grass reading, so she was well educated on top of everything else. I was delighted to note her choice of reading matter, not just any old book, but Professor Nightingale's Encyclopedia of Marvelous Life Forms and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs. She actually owned a hardback edition of that work. What a sound basis for endless conversations of an intellectual nature. Could she possibly be, like me, a graduate of the Nocturnal Academy? I drew up a mental balance sheet. She was beautiful, intelligent, kind to animals. She could cook and sing. She was a bear and had blue fur. All these items went down on the asset side. In the end, I took to following her on her walks through the forest. I did so at a due distance, flitting from tree to tree like a timid, demented woodland sprite. Numerous animals converged on her and suffered her to fondle them. They emerged from their hiding places whenever the girl went. Squirrels hopped in time to her singing and squeaked the tune. A white stag sometimes hung her basket on its antlers and carried it a while. She was obviously popular with all the creatures of the forest and adept at communing with them. Even savage wild boars became playful pets in her presence. I now spied on her at every opportunity and on every occasion, from her morning yawn and stretched in the cottage doorway to her nightly blowing out the candles on her windowsill. I blushed with shame as I penned these words, watched her at her morning ablutions in the stream. I had never derived such an inexplicable feeling of happiness purely from looking at someone, or more surprising still, just from thinking about them, and this feeling became more intense with every hour. Every day I spent in the proximity of the girl Bluebear, so in turn did my abhorrence of myself and my craven failure to reveal my presence. Morning after morning I vowed I would wait for a favorable moment to emerge from the forest, politely introduce myself, and make her a proposal of marriage. Instead, I continued to cower among the rhubarb leaves like a frightened rabbit. One morning, when I woke rather later than usual, the girl Bluebear had already disappeared into the forest. For a while I cursed myself for oversleeping, then plumbing the very depths of infamy, I decided that this would be an excellent opportunity to sneak into the girl's private domain. I stole across this clearing and started up the veranda steps. The first step gave under my unaccustomed weight, and an agonized groan went echoing through the forest. I promptly recoiled and paused to listen. Was she coming back? No, not a sound. The uninvited guest. So I crept across the veranda and through the door into the little kitchen living room. Heavens, what a dear little place! Ranged on the shelves were teacups designed for dainty little paws. Beside them, tiny plates just big enough to accommodate a mouthful. Yes, indeed, everything in the cottage seemed specially designed for someone at least 3 sizes smaller than me. I went over to the miniature stove and lifted the lid of an equally diminutive saucepan. What joy! It contained 5 dear little dumplings, floating in creamy brown gravy, and before I knew it, I'd wolfed one of them. Delicious dumplings. It tasted sensational. A potato flour dumpling, simmered to a turn, perfectly seasoned and enriched with saffron, velvety on the outside and soft as a pear within. At its heart was a preternaturally light dough consisting of breadcrumbs, raisins, and dried plums. This gave off an aroma of onions, nutmeg, black pepper that tickled the gums before the dumpling melted on the tongue like butter. I had never dreamed that the culinary art could elevate such a simple dish to such heights. However, the dumpling wasn't a patch on the gravy or sauce that went with it, and this nectar, which had doubtless been carefully simmered for days over a low heat, reducing it to an essence, hand-picked mushrooms had dissolved into pure flavor. An entire forest, complete with the scent of rosin and pine needles, the freshness of the morning dew, and the wholesome juices of berries and herbs, enveloped my tongue. All my conjectures about the girl Bluebear's culinary skill were surpassed. I wriggled in ecstasy as the dumpling slid down my throat. Then I came to my senses. Had I left an indication of my presence? Did the girl Bluebear count her dumplings before she left the house? There are 4 left. What a cold, uncongenial, rectangular number. Wouldn't 3 dumplings look considerably more aesthetically pleasing and be less likely to arouse suspicion than 4? All good things come in threes, as everyone knows, so down the offending little dumpling. I wouldn't have thought it possible that this one could have excelled its predecessor in refinement, but it was true. It had a heart of apricot and cinnamon seasoned with ground white pepper. Exquisite! I emitted a jubilant, blissful growl, half tempted to roll around on the floor in ecstasy. I had never tasted anything more delicious. What surprises did the 3 remaining dumplings conceal beneath their velvety white coats? Would it make a perceptible difference if the girl Bluebear found only 2 dumplings instead of 3? I doubted it. The next dumpling had a rhubarb and cottage cheese filling, flavored with honey, supremely delectable. It's common knowledge that the honey holds a special attraction for bears. Right in the middle of the dumpling, doubly protected by the dough and the cottage cheese filling, was a hazelnut-sized blob of pure acacia honey. This, when it took my tongue by surprise, sent me into such gustatory frenzy that I actually shook a leg. I broke into a kind of dumpling worship dance, so to speak, hopping in a circle like a Native American, and growling rhythmically as I did so. In passing, I rather casually wolfed the 2 remaining dumplings, one filled with plum jam, the other with cranberries and cream cheese. Then I proceeded to lick the saucepan clean. Bending over the stove, I lapped up the mushroom sauce like a husky dying of thirst. "Hello," said a voice behind me. I straightened with a jerk and turned around. I've only seen 2 spectacles during my various lives that impressed me as being flawlessly beautiful. One was a view from Mac's back of the ice mountains in the Antarctic Circle, illuminated by the aurora australis. The other, for all the embarrassment of the moment, was the sight of the girl Bluebear, standing in the doorway with a basketful of berries, smiling at me. I stammered, completely at a loss. She looked at me, and there was no surprise or fear in her gaze, still less annoyance or anger. She looked at me.